Thor in 3D. At the time, this was fantastic for 3D stereo conversion. There's no visible warping. The foreground, mainly the actors, are not typical cardboard cutouts, but usually have perceivable stereo geometry that renders a pretty good 3D illusion. And this deserves a moment to consider. It is actually better than what is possible with natively shot 3D. With real 3D, you often have to choose between a complex foreground or a usable background. If you want to go for a lot of stereo texture in the actor, that means the camera eyes are far apart and angled inwards, and you end up with a background that is extremely far apart and almost impossible to view under certain circumstances. Now, to get around this, movies of old had to film in front of something plain like blue sky or white walls, or they kept the background very close, like having the walls nearly touching the actor's back. Often they did both, which is, well, it works, but it's boring. And here we are seeing the earliest time that conversion was able to offer a third solution, giving us both a detailed foreground figure and an enjoyable background that our eyes would never be able to reproduce in nature. Now, it doesn't hold a candle to the stereo magic they would pull off just a few years later, but perhaps it's unfair to hold it to that standard. Not that I'm here to criticize, I just like to notice how they go about their craft. Now, for instance, if you slow this down, you might notice that the explosions kind of expand like they're bubbles instead of a gas. But they do obscure this by covering it up in a layer of sparks, so the illusions do hold up. And also notice reflections on the floor in this shot have no depth. Perhaps they hadn't really figured that out yet, or maybe production time constraints caused the conversion team to pick their battles. Indeed, most of the backgrounds in this movie are usually flat. It's the type of stereo where you can usually count the layers on one hand, with more attention going toward whatever is closest to the viewer. Here at the bar, we see a couple of bottles of beer that each occupy a believable area in space. And along with the implied perspective, it is enough to trick the mind into thinking there's depth further into the room. Notice after Thor's beer, it is completely flat, yet it still works in its primitive way. And here, the scaffolding and isolation tents set up in the desert look like they were made for 3D. But I didn't really notice a moment that put any of this geometry in any significant stereo. Later, when it starts raining on top of it, that rain effect is layered on top effectively, as it usually is in 3D. Though if you look closely, you can see the original rain kind of wrap around the bodies of the actors. Also, notice here, Loki is lightly warped, but the rest of the shot is untouched. This comes frighteningly close to the kind of stuff you might get from those rip-off fake 3D German B-movie releases. But again, it's another example of where the implied perspective created by the angle of the shot goes a long way to make us believe that we are still in 3D land. However, a tornado shot does not get away with its shortcuts. It's depressingly shallow, save for some select debris in the foreground. This moment was almost sad. I really wish they could have given us that tunnel effect for this moment. For comparison, notice a similar shot in Ragnarok that gives us the illusion of a pathway. Now, in this scene, Thor gets his hospital bill. Overall, the 3D mainly exists in separating the actors from the background and particle effects tastefully layered over anything exciting. It's minimal, but it does work. The major complaint is the backgrounds are often ignored, and they're usually the most beautiful part of these shots. Story-wise, when I first saw it in the theater, I felt underwhelmed. On present-day rewatch, I think that might be because it started big with armies of nasty-looking icemen, seemingly straight out of Game of Thrones. And in those early scenes, we had such massive and beautiful background mats, albeit a little flat. But later, it all converges on a single location in the middle of a very plain desert with a single bad guy who, even for the time, looked like underdeveloped CGI. It felt like a big budget movie morphed into a cost-cutting TV show somewhere in the middle. A bit unique among the Thor movies in that it actually has something to say. I'm not sure it succeeds, but it's a noble attempt. For a director, they brought in Kenneth Branagh, if I say that correctly, who, well, I don't know what his reputation today is, but back then, his reputation was that of being the Shakespeare guy. And I suppose at this time they envisioned Thor as being a symbol of classical honor. Here, Thor is not yet the walking punchline we know today, but is impervious and rash. And Thor loves to win. In some ways, his idea of love is how he feels at any particular moment. It reminds me, the old book says, the root of all evil is not actually money, but love. And Odin sees this Thor's kind of love will leave a trail of destruction, and Thor is asked to raise his standard of love. Sounds like the makings of a classic. It isn't, but like the 3D conversion, it was a noble attempt to add some dimension to the Marvel universe.